There was a cereal that came in a box with a king on the front, a little king with a crown, looking out like he owned the whole breakfast table. The pieces inside were shaped like tiny crowns too. They were crunchy, lightly sweet, and they held up in milk longer than almost anything else on the shelf. Not too sugary, not too plain, exactly right. At its peak, that box was in kitchens from Maine to California. It sat on the shelves of Kroger, A&P, and Food Lion for over 50 years. Two generations of American families grew up reaching for it on Saturday mornings. Kids who became parents and then bought it for their own kids. It was the cereal your mother approved of and you actually wanted to eat. It was just always there. And then, in 2019, it wasn't. No announcement, no farewell, no explanation from the company that made it. One week the box was on the shelf. The next week, something else was in its place. How does a cereal that fed American families for half a century simply disappear without a single word from the people who made it? This is the story of King Vitaman, and it turns out the answer says something about all of us. In 1968, the Quaker Oats Company already knew how to make a cereal that children loved. They had done it twice. Cap and Crunch had launched in 1963 and turned into a phenomenon. Quisp followed in 1965, riding the same wave. Both were built around the same basic idea: a crunchy corn and oat base, lightly sweetened, shaped into something a child could recognize and remember. Both were animated by J. Ward Productions, the studio behind Rocky and Bullwinkle, and both were selling well enough that Quaker's cereal division had earned a reputation as one of the most creative in the business. But there was a gap in the market that neither product filled. American parents in the late 1960s were beginning to think differently about breakfast. The country was changing. More mothers were entering the workforce. Mornings were getting shorter, more rushed, more complicated. A bowl of cereal was no longer just a treat. It was often the only meal a child would eat before school. And if that was the case, parents wanted to count for something. They wanted nutrition. They wanted vitamins. They wanted a cereal they could feel good about putting in front of their kids. Quaker saw that opening, and they moved to fill it. The product they developed was built around a simple promise: a cereal that tasted good enough for children and was fortified enough for parents. A corn and oat base, the same family of flavors as Cap'n Crunch and Quisp, but with a nutritional profile that set it apart. The pieces were shaped like tiny crowns. The name at first was going to be straightforward: King Vitaman. Then the FDA stepped in. Federal regulations in the 1960s were tightening around health claims on food labels. The agency ruled that the word vitamin could not appear in the name of a product that was not itself a pharmaceutical vitamin supplement. A cereal, no matter how fortified, did not qualify. The name King Vitaman was rejected. Quaker's response was as simple as it was stubborn. They changed one letter. The I became an A. King Vitaman. The FDA approved it, the lawyers cleared it, and the brand was born out of a single-letter compromise between a company's ambition and a regulator's rulebook. J. Ward Productions was brought in to build the world around that name. The same studio that had given Cap'n Crunch his nautical swagger and Quisp his alien charm now designed a king, short, red-haired, mustachioed, with a long nose and a crown that sat slightly crooked on his head. He was not a grand, imposing monarch. He was a scrappy, opinionated little ruler who took his cereal very seriously and had very little patience for incompetence. His knights, Sir Laphatup and Sir Cravenly, were bumbling and well-meaning. His enemies, the Blue Baron and the Not-So-Bright Knight, were more ridiculous than threatening. The whole kingdom existed for one purpose: to protect the cereal and get it into the right hands. The voice of the king was Joe Flynn, best known at the time as the long-suffering Captain Binghamton on the ABC series McHale's Navy. Flynn played the king as a man of absolute conviction, quick to frustration, quick to recover, and completely certain that his cereal was the most important thing in the realm. The knights were voiced by Paul Frees, who also voiced Toucan Sam, and Bill Scott, the man behind Bullwinkle J. Moose. The production had the same irreverent energy as everything else J. Ward touched. Smart, fast, and genuinely funny for a 30-second commercial. The first boxes hit supermarket shelves in 1968. The cereal inside made good on the promise printed on the outside. It contained what Quaker advertised as 100% of the minimum daily adult requirements for vitamins and iron as established by the U.S. government. The pieces were crisp and satisfying. The sweetness was real but restrained. 6 grams of sugar per serving compared to 13 or more in Cap'n Crunch and Lucky Charms. Someone in a Quaker boardroom had made the call. This was the cereal for the family that wanted something better. Something that tasted like a reward and worked like a vitamin. Something fit for a king. They had no idea how long that king would actually reign. Picture a Saturday morning in 1972. Not an abstract one, a specific one. The sun is barely up. The house is quiet in that particular way it only gets before the rest of the family wakes. A child slides out of bed, pads down the hallway in socks, and turns on the television. The set takes a moment to warm up. The picture comes in, and on ABC, the cartoons have already started. This was the ritual, not just in one house, in millions of houses, from Ohio to Oregon, from Texas to Connecticut. Saturday morning was the one block of time in the week that belonged entirely to children. No school, no schedule, no one asking them to be somewhere else yet. Just the couch, the TV, and the cereal. The box of King Vitaman came down from the shelf. It was impossible to miss. The king staring out from the front with that slightly crooked crown and that expression of complete authority. The child poured a bowl. Those little crown-shaped pieces made a sound when they hit the ceramic. A light, dry clatter. The milk went in, and the cereal held. It didn't dissolve the way some cereals did. It stayed crisp, held its shape, gave back something satisfying with every spoonful. The milk at the bottom of the bowl stayed white. No artificial colors bleeding out, no green or purple staining the spoon. Just the taste, lightly sweet, toasted corn and oat, with a texture that worked with the milk instead of surrendering to it. On the television, between cartoons, the king himself appeared. The J. Ward commercials were unlike almost anything else on Saturday morning television. Most cereal ads of the era were pure sugar rush energy. Fast cuts, bright colors, children screaming with delight. The King Vitaman spots had a different rhythm. They had wit. The king would be mid-instruction, directing one of his knights to pour milk over the cereal, and the knight would misunderstand completely and drench the king instead. The king would sputter indignant and deliver the line that half a generation of American children could recite by heart. "Not me, you dingaling, the cereal." Then the jingle would bring it home. Have breakfast with the king, and the commercial would end, and the cartoon would come back on, and the child on the couch would take another spoonful. That was the genius of it. The commercial and the cereal and the Saturday morning ritual were all one continuous experience. You watched the king on television. You ate the king's cereal at the table. The box sat facing you the whole time. And on the back of the box, there was something else waiting. A maze, a puzzle, a hidden picture to solve. The box was not just packaging. It was the second half of the entertainment. Quaker understood this and leaned into it. Through the early 1970s, King Vitaman boxes offered some of the most creative back panel activities in the cereal aisle. There were cutout masks, treasure hunts, and visual puzzles designed to last the length of a bowl. In 1972, boxes advertised the Click and Count Premium, a small mechanical toy available by sending in proof of purchase. In 1975, a Viewmaster offer ran on the box, giving children a reason to save every top and count every bowl. These were not accidents. They were a deliberate strategy to make King Vitaman not just a food, but a destination. A reason to ask for it in the store, a reason to look forward to opening a new box. Then in 1971, Quaker made a decision that no other major cereal brand had made before, and very few have made since. They retired the animated king and replaced him with a real person. His name was George Mann. He was a veteran of vaudeville, half of the comedic dance act Bartow and Mann, a man who had spent decades performing in front of live audiences and understood instinctively how to hold attention. Quaker dressed him in a checkered robe and a crown made of golden spoons and put him on the cereal box and in the television commercials starting in 1971. He played the role straight, not as a joke, not as a winking, ironic mascot, but as a man who genuinely believed in the importance of a good breakfast and was not going to apologize for it. The effect was remarkable. A real face on a cereal box does something different to a child than a cartoon face. It creates a kind of accountability. The king on the box looks like someone's grandfather. A little theatrical, a little self-important, but fundamentally trustworthy. Parents responded to it. The cereal was already approved by nutritionists and by the federal WIC program, which certified it as an acceptable staple for families receiving food assistance. Now it had a face that looked like it belonged at the table. George Mann stayed on the box and in the commercials until his death in 1977. For 6 years, he was one of the most recognized faces in the American breakfast aisle. People who bought King Vitaman in those years remember him specifically. Not just the box, not just the cereal, but the man in the crown who seemed to take the whole enterprise personally. One commenter on MrBreakfast.com, writing decades later, described buying the cereal as a small child in the early 1970s, his grandfather lifting the box down from the top shelf with a pair of long store tongs. The memory was not really about the cereal, it was about the grandfather and the store and the weight of the box coming down. The cereal was just the anchor that held the memory in place. That is what King Vitaman was, at its best. Not the most famous cereal in America, not the one with the wildest mascot or the most sugar or the prize that every kid on the block was talking about. It was the one that was simply, reliably, genuinely there. On the shelf, on the table, on the television, on the back of the box. A constant, a fixture. The kind of thing that only reveals its full value the moment it stops being there. What was it about that crown on the box that made a child feel like breakfast was worth getting up for? Nobody at Quaker Oats was asking that question in 1972. They were too busy watching the cereal sell. But the answer mattered more than any of them knew. Because the day would come when the crown was gone, and the question would be all that remained. By the early 1970s, King Vitaman was no longer a new product finding its footing. It was a working part of the American breakfast landscape. On shelves, in homes, in the weekly grocery run that families made without much deliberation. You needed cereal. You went to Kroger or A&P or Safeway. You reached for the box with the king on it. That was the transaction. Simple, unremarkable, and repeated millions of times a year across the country. But behind that simple transaction was a machine, a distribution network, a shelf space negotiation, a chain of decisions made by sales reps and grocery buyers and regional managers that determined whether that box was at eye level or on the top shelf, whether it was in Cleveland or also in Charlotte, whether it was in the store at all. And understanding how that machine worked is the only way to understand what eventually broke it. Quaker's great advantage in the cereal market was that King Vitaman did not have to build its distribution from scratch. Cap'n Crunch had done that work already. By the time King Vitaman launched in 1968, Quaker had established relationships with every major grocery chain in the country. The new cereal rode those relationships into stores it could not have entered on its own. It was placed on shelves alongside Cap'n Crunch and Quisp, benefiting from the traffic those brands had already earned. In the language of the grocery business, King Vitaman was a line extension, a product that expanded Quaker's presence in the breakfast aisle without requiring a full investment in new retail relationships. This was efficient. It was also a ceiling. Because Cap'n Crunch was always going to be the priority. It had the larger marketing budget, the more aggressive advertising schedule, the stronger sales numbers. When Quaker's cereal division had to make decisions about where to put its resources, the answer was almost always Cap'n Crunch first, Quisp second, and King Vitaman somewhere after that. The king got what was left, shelf space that remained after the bigger brands were accommodated, advertising dollars that were available after the flagship campaigns were funded. What saved King Vitaman from irrelevance in those years was a decision that had nothing to do with marketing and everything to do with policy. The United States federal government's WIC program, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, certified King Vitaman as an approved food benefit. This meant that families receiving WIC assistance could use their benefits to purchase King Vitaman cereal. For a product that was competing against flashier, more heavily advertised rivals, this certification was not a small thing. It opened the cereal to a segment of the American population that the Saturday morning cartoon demographic did not reach. Working families, single mothers, households where the grocery budget was measured carefully, and a government-approved product carried real weight. King Vitaman became, quietly and without fanfare, the cereal of practical America. Not the cereal you saw the most commercials for. Not the one with the wildest prize inside the box. The one that was there, that was affordable, that the government said was good enough, and that tasted better than most of the alternatives at its price point. In communities across the Midwest and the South, in cities and small towns where Kroger and Food Lion anchored the weekly shopping, King Vitamin found a loyalty that no advertising campaign had manufactured. It was earned bowl by bowl, Saturday by Saturday, family by family. But loyalty, as it turns out, is not the same thing as visibility. And in the grocery business, visibility is everything. The cereal aisle in an American supermarket in the 1970s was a battlefield. New products launched constantly. General Mills was pushing Count Chocula, Frankenberry, and Boo Berry into stores starting in 1971, backed by heavy television advertising timed to Halloween season. Kellogg's was defending its position with Frosted Flakes and Fruit Loops. Post was running Sugar Bear and Honey Smacks. Every major food company in America understood that the breakfast cereal market was one of the most profitable per square foot categories in the store, and every one of them was fighting for the same limited shelf space. In that environment, a product without a major advertising campaign was at a structural disadvantage. Shelf space in a grocery store is not assigned by merit. It is negotiated. Brands with large advertising budgets could argue that their television presence would drive customers into the store, looking specifically for their product. Brands without that presence had to compete on price and on the goodwill of grocery buyers who remembered the product performing well in previous years. King Vitamin had goodwill. It had its WX certification. It had 50 years of quietly reliable sales. What it did not have, increasingly, was the kind of marketing investment that told grocery buyers it was worth a premium shelf position. And so the machine that had carried King Vitamin into stores across America in the 1960s and 1970s began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to shift its weight toward other products. The King was still on the shelf. The boxes were still moving. The families who knew it were still buying it. But the engine that drives a consumer product forward, the advertising, the promotions, the investment that signals to the market that a brand still has a future, that engine was running quieter with every passing year. Nobody noticed it yet. The cereal was still there. The King was still on the box. And for the families who bought it every week, that was enough. For now, there is a particular kind of product that earns its place in American life, not through spectacle, but through presence. Not the cereal everyone is talking about. Not the one with the prize that every kid in the neighborhood wants. The one that is simply always there, on the shelf when you need it, in the cart without discussion, on the table before anyone has said a word. King Vitamin, at the height of its cultural life, was exactly that kind of product. And that kind of presence is harder to build than any advertising campaign, and far harder to replace once it is gone. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, King Vitamin occupied a specific and irreplaceable position in the American breakfast aisle. It was not the most popular cereal in the country. It was not the one that generated the most excitement or sold the most boxes per week. But it was consistent in a way that flashier products rarely managed to be. While other cereals came and went, launched with enormous fanfare, ran for a few years and quietly disappeared when the novelty wore off, King Vitamin stayed. It outlasted competitors that had outsold it. It outlasted trends that had threatened to make it obsolete. It was still there when the children who had first eaten it in 1970 were grown adults buying groceries for families of their own. That kind of longevity does something to a product. It stops being a choice and starts being an assumption. Parents who had grown up eating King Vitamin did not deliberate over it in the cereal aisle. They reached for it the way they reach for milk or bread, automatically without conscious consideration. It was part of the household inventory, a constant in a life full of variables. And when those parents put the box on the table for their own children, something passed between the generations that had nothing to do with vitamins or corn and oat formulas. It was the transmission of a ritual. This is what we eat on Saturday morning. This is what breakfast looks like in this family. This is the box with the king on it. The children of the 1980s who grew up with King Vitaman were the second generation of its audience. They did not discover it the way the first generation had, through the J. Ward commercials, through the novelty of the animated king and his bumbling knights. By the time these children were eating it, the animated commercials were gone, and George Mann was gone, and the cereal had settled into a quieter phase of its life. But the box was still vivid. The back panel activities were still there. The crown-shaped pieces were still exactly the same. And the taste, that specific combination of lightly toasted corn and oat, that restrained sweetness that made the milk at the bottom of the bowl worth drinking, that had not changed. One woman, writing on MrBreakfast.com years after the cereal was discontinued, described craving King Vitaman during her first pregnancy in the 1970s. She said she could have lived on it. The memory she was describing was not nutritional. It was physical and emotional. The specific comfort of a flavor that had been part of her life since childhood, suddenly intensified by circumstances that made comfort matter more than usual. That is not a relationship people have with products that are merely adequate. That is a relationship people have with things that are genuinely woven into the fabric of their daily lives. King Vitaman had earned those relationships one box at a time, one Saturday morning at a time, in kitchens across the country that looked nothing alike and had everything in common. The ranch house in Nebraska and the apartment in Cleveland and the row house in Baltimore. Different families, different circumstances, different everything, but the same box on the table, the same king on the front, the same little crowns in the bowl. By the mid-1980s, King Vitaman had been a fixture of American breakfast culture for nearly 2 decades. It had survived the cereal wars of the 1970s, when General Mills and Kellogg's flooded the market with new products and fought for every inch of shelf space. It had survived the first wave of health food concern, when parents began looking more carefully at sugar content and ingredient lists. It had survived the loss of its most recognizable human mascot. It was, by any reasonable measure, a durable and legitimate American institution. What it had not done, and what no one inside Quaker seemed to consider urgent, was evolve. The advertising had gone quiet. The mascot had gone static. The box looked almost identical to the way it had looked 15 years earlier, which was either reassuring consistency or a sign that no one was paying close attention, depending on which side of the boardroom you were standing on. The families buying King Vitaman in 1985 did not know any of that. They knew the cereal. They trusted the box. They believed in the way that people believe in things that have always been there, that it would continue to be there. That belief, it turned out, was more fragile than anyone realized. George Mann died in 1977. He was a vaudeville performer who had spent the last 6 years of his life as the face of a breakfast cereal, and he had done the job with more dignity and conviction than anyone had a right to expect. After his death, Quaker kept his image on the box for a period. A ghost king, presiding over a product that was still selling, but no longer speaking. No new commercials were made to replace the ones he had appeared in. No new mascot was introduced to fill the space he had left. The animated king from the J. Ward era was gone. The live-action king was gone. And the television screen, which had once been one of King Vitaman's most powerful tools for reaching the families who bought it, went quiet. That silence lasted more than 2 decades. From the late 1970s through the entire decade of the 1980s and into the 1990s, King Vitaman essentially disappeared from American television. The cereal was still in stores. The boxes were still on shelves. Families who had been buying it for years continued to buy it, out of habit and loyalty, and the simple fact that it was still there. But for a child who did not already know what King Vitaman was, a child who had not grown up watching the J. Ward commercials or seeing George Mann's face on the box, there was no longer any reason to notice it. The cereal had stopped introducing itself to new generations. It was living entirely off the loyalty of the people who already loved it. This is the kind of problem that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a crisis or a scandal or a sudden drop in sales that triggers an emergency meeting. It arrives quietly over years as the audience that remembers a product ages and the audience that might have replaced them never gets introduced. King Vitaman in 1985 was still selling, But the people buying it were, on average, older than the people who had been buying it in 1975. And the children who were waking up on Saturday mornings in 1985, pouring cereal while the cartoons played, were reaching for boxes that were advertising themselves. Cap'n Crunch with its new flavor extensions, Count Chocula with its Halloween promotions, Honey Smacks with its Saturday morning ad buys. King Vitaman was not in that conversation anymore. At the same time, the cereal market itself was changing in ways that put King Vitaman in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a new category of breakfast cereal was emerging, the adult health cereal. Brands like All Bran, Raisin Bran, and granola-based products were growing their shelf presence, speaking directly to the baby boomer generation that was aging out of sugar-forward children's cereals and beginning to think about fiber, cholesterol, and long-term health. These were not King Vitaman's competitors in the traditional sense. They were selling something different, but they were occupying shelf space and consumer attention in a way that complicated the already difficult position King Vitaman had always occupied. Too nutritious to be a pure indulgence, not nutritious enough to be a serious health food. King Vitaman had always lived in that middle ground. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, that middle ground was a good place to be. Parents wanted vitamins, children wanted crunch. King Vitaman delivered both. But by the mid-1980s, the middle ground was getting crowded from both sides, and the product had no active voice in the market to defend its position. It could not remind parents why it was different. It could not introduce itself to children who had never heard of it. It just sat on the shelf and waited for the people who already knew it to come find it. Some of them did. Loyally, consistently, for years longer than the market dynamics would have predicted. There were families in Ohio who drove out of their way to a specific Mark's store because that was the one place in the area that still reliably stocked it. There were shoppers in Florida who noticed when their local Publix stopped carrying it and wrote letters asking why. There were mothers in the South who had been buying it since their own childhoods and could not imagine starting a Saturday morning any other way. But loyalty, however deep, cannot substitute for new customers, and new customers require awareness. And awareness in the consumer packaged goods business requires investment. The investment had stopped. How long can a cereal sit on the shelf before the shelf itself forgets why it's there? The people at Quaker Oats who were responsible for King Vitaman in those years were not indifferent. The cereal was still performing well enough that discontinuing it would have seemed unnecessary, even wasteful. It had its WWAC certification. It had its loyal base. It was not losing money in any dramatic sense. It was simply losing ground, slowly, steadily, in the way that things lose ground when no one is actively fighting to hold the position. By the time PepsiCo acquired Quaker Oats in 2001 for $13.4 billion, King Vitaman was already a different product than it had been in its peak years. Not in formula, not in taste, but in cultural weight. It had gone from a cereal that defined Saturday morning for millions of American families to a cereal that a specific and aging group of loyal customers still sought out in specific stores, in specific cities, while the rest of the country had moved on without quite realizing it had left something behind. The cracks had been there for 20 years. Nobody had filled them, and now the building was about to change hands. In August of 2001, PepsiCo completed its acquisition of the Quaker Oats Company for approximately $13.4 billion in stock. It was one of the largest food industry mergers in American history, and it was not, in any meaningful sense, about cereal. The prize PepsiCo was after was Gatorade, the sports drink that Quaker had acquired in 1983 and grown into the dominant force in the American hydration market. Gatorade alone was worth most of the purchase price. Everything else that came with Quaker, the oatmeal, the rice cakes, the granola bars, and yes, the breakfast cereals, was, in the language of corporate acquisitions, portfolio assets. Things that came along with the thing you actually wanted. Cap'n Crunch was a portfolio asset. Life cereal was a portfolio asset. Quisp was a portfolio asset. And King Vitaman, with its aging loyal base and its near-zero advertising spend, and its quiet shelf presence in Kroger and Food Lion and Mark's, was a portfolio asset that no one at PepsiCo headquarters in Purchase, New York, was spending much time thinking about. This is not a story of malice. The people who made decisions about King Vitamin after 2001 were not sitting in conference rooms plotting the destruction of a beloved American institution. They were running spreadsheets. They were managing a portfolio of hundreds of products across dozens of categories, allocating resources according to return on investment, making the kinds of decisions that large corporations make every day without drama or ceremony. King Vitamin showed up in those spreadsheets as a small, stable, low-growth product with a loyal but shrinking customer base and no meaningful marketing investment. In the logic of a company the size of PepsiCo, that profile has a name. It is called a tail brand, and tail brands in most corporate portfolio strategies exist in one of two states: managed decline or discontinuation. The year 2000 had produced one last attempt to breathe life into the king. Quaker, still independent at that point, had introduced a new illustrated mascot, King Vitaman III, a wiser, older figure with a white beard and a purple robe, drawn in a style that evokes something between a medieval wizard and a kindly grandfather. The intention was clearly to signal renewal, to tell the market that the brand was still alive and still evolving. The new king appeared on the box with a freshness that the packaging had not had in years, but there were no television commercials to support him. No Saturday morning ad buy. No campaign of any kind that would have introduced this new version of the king to children who had never seen the old ones. The mascot arrived on the box in 2000 and stayed there, a portrait of a king with no kingdom, visible to anyone who happened to pick up the box, invisible to everyone who did not already know to look for it. A mascot without advertising is not a marketing strategy. It is a placeholder, and placeholders do not save brands. When PepsiCo took ownership in 2001, the new illustrated king came along with everything else, and the new ownership had no particular reason to invest in a campaign around a cereal that was generating modest and declining revenues in a category, children's breakfast cereal, that was itself under pressure from shifting consumer preferences. The early 2000s were not a good time to be a lightly sweetened children's cereal with no active advertising presence. The organic food movement was gaining momentum. Parents were reading ingredient labels with new seriousness. The conversation around children's nutrition was growing louder, and cereals with any meaningful sugar content were increasingly on the defensive, regardless of how many vitamins they contained. King Vitaman's nutritional positioning, the very thing that had made it distinctive in 1968, had become complicated. In 1968, 6 grams of sugar per serving with a full complement of vitamins was a genuine differentiator. It meant something. By 2005, 6 grams of sugar per serving was still lower than most of its competitors. But the category had shifted. Consumers who cared about nutrition were moving toward whole grain, high fiber, low sugar options that King Vitamin could not match. Consumers who did not care about nutrition were buying Cap'n Crunch or Honey Smacks or Cinnamon Toast Crunch. The middle ground that King Vitamin had occupied so successfully for so long was narrowing to a sliver. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, the evidence of the brand's retreat accumulated in the places where its most loyal customers lived. Reports began appearing on cereal enthusiast forums and grocery comment boards. Food Lion had stopped carrying it. A Publix in Orlando had not restocked it in months. A commenter on MrBreakfast.com in 2010 wrote, with genuine alarm, "Has Quaker discontinued King Vitamin?" It was still a WIC item. Usually those are never discontinued, but the boxes were getting harder to find. The distribution that had once been genuinely national was contracting. First to regional chains, then to specific stores within those chains, then to a handful of locations that loyal customers sought out with increasing effort. One man, writing from the Cleveland area, described the Mark's store near his home as the last reliable place within reasonable distance where he could find King Vitamin. He drove out of his way to get there. He kept going back, checking the shelf, hoping. The cereal was still there for a while, and then gradually it wasn't. Nobody called him to explain why. Nobody called anyone. By 2018, the comments on cereal review sites had taken on a quality that was less like product feedback and more like dispatches from a disappearing world. Someone in Florida had not seen a box in 2 years. Someone in Nebraska remembered buying it in Plainview, and wondered if it was still sold anywhere. Someone else reported that the current version tasted bland compared to the original, a shadow of what it had been, maintaining the name but not the spirit. The brand was still technically alive, but it was living the way things live when no one is actively sustaining them, on residual momentum, on the inertia of a supply chain that had not yet been formally told to stop. The decision, when it finally came, was made without public announcement. PepsiCo cited declining sales volumes and shifting consumer preferences. The language was corporate and clean and said nothing about the families who had been buying the cereal for 50 years, or the children who had sent in box tops for click-and-count toys in 1972, or the man in Cleveland who drove out of his way to a specific Mark's because it was the last place he knew where the king still lived. Production ceased in 2019. The final boxes sold through by 2020. And then the shelf was empty and something else filled the space, and the grocery store looked exactly the same as it always had. That is how a 51-year reign ends. Not with a battle, not with a scandal, with a line in a spreadsheet and a decision made in a building where no one had eaten King Vitaman for breakfast in a very long time. The man from Cleveland had been driving out of his way for years. The Mark's store was not on his regular route. It was a detour, a deliberate addition to a trip that would have been shorter and easier without it. But Mark's had King Vitaman. And as long as Mark's had King Vitaman, the detour was worth making. He wrote about it on MrBreakfast.com with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a reasonable habit. Not embarrassed by it, not sentimental about it, simply explaining the arithmetic of loyalty. The store was out of the way, the cereal was worth it. That was the whole calculation. He was not alone. Across the country, through the 2010s, King Vitaman had become the kind of product that required effort to find. Not impossible effort, not a special order or an online purchase, but the kind of low-grade, persistent effort that reveals exactly how much something matters to the person making it. You learned which stores in your area still carried it. You checked the shelf when you were there. You noted with quiet satisfaction that the box was in stock. And you noted with a particular kind of unease that was hard to name when it was not. That unease had been building for years before 2019. The distribution had been contracting since the early 2000s, pulling back from chain after chain in a retreat so gradual that it was easy to mistake for a temporary supply issue. A store would stop carrying it, and a loyal customer would assume it was a restocking problem. A delay, a regional distribution hiccup, something that would resolve itself in a few weeks. Sometimes it did. More often, it didn't. The box simply never came back to that particular shelf, and the customer either found another store that carried it or quietly stopped buying it. The way people quietly stop doing things that have become too inconvenient without ever making a formal decision to stop. By 2018, the signals were unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The cereal enthusiast communities online, MrBreakfast.com, the cereal-focused corners of Reddit, the Facebook groups where adults who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s gathered to remember the foods of their childhoods, were filling with reports that had the quality of field dispatches from a slow disaster. Someone in Orlando had not seen a box in 2 years and was wondering if others had the same experience. Someone else reported that their local Food Lion had stopped carrying it entirely. A commenter in Nebraska wrote that they had bought it years ago in plain view and had been looking for it ever since without success. The question that kept appearing in slightly different forms was always the same. Is it still out there? Does anyone know where to find it? The answer by 2019 was no. In the summer and early fall of that year, the remaining boxes sold through at the stores that had still been carrying them. There was no announcement from PepsiCo or Quaker, no press release, no social media post, no letter to customers who had been buying the product for decades. The company that had introduced King Vitaman to America in 1968, that had put a king on a box and a jingle on the television, and a tiny crown-shaped piece of cereal in the hands of 2 generations of American children, said nothing. The cereal simply stopped arriving at stores. The shelf space was reassigned, and King Vitaman ceased to exist as a purchasable product in the United States. The community that had loved it found out the way communities find out about things that institutions decline to announce, through accumulation. Enough people reported that they could not find it. Enough stores confirmed they were not restocking it. Enough searches came back empty. And then someone on MrBreakfast.com wrote, in September of 2019, with the quiet finality of someone marking a date on a headstone, "Rest in peace, King Vitaman cereal, 1968 to 2019. The cereal world won't be the same without you." That comment sat on a website devoted to breakfast cereal reviews. It was not reported by any major news outlet. There was no obituary in the food press, no segment on the morning shows, no cultural moment of acknowledgement proportional to the 51 years the product had spent in American kitchens. King Vitaman had been too quiet in its later years, too niche, too much a product of loyalty rather than spectacle, to earn the kind of send-off that more loudly marketed brands sometimes receive when they disappear. It just ended, and the people who cared about it were left to mark the loss themselves in comment sections and Facebook posts and conversations with siblings who remembered the same Saturday mornings. The response when it came was genuine and immediate and entirely without corporate audience. On change.org, a petition appeared for Quaker to bring back King Vitaman cereal. The language was plain and unsentimental. The cereal was perfect, the petition author wrote. Not only did it taste good, it was affordable for families living on a budget. They asked everyone who loved it to sign and share. The petition collected signatures. It did not collect enough to matter to a company the size of PepsiCo, and Quaker never responded to it publicly. But the signatures that did come in told a story that no market research document had bothered to capture. These were people for whom the cereal was not a luxury or a novelty. It was a staple. It was what breakfast cost when money was tight and nutrition still mattered. It was the box that fit in the WIC budget and tasted like something a child would actually eat. A second petition followed, titled simply, "Bring Back King Vitaman Cereal," gathering its own small community of signatories who had discovered the loss and could not quite believe no one in a position of authority seemed to care. As of 2026, neither petition has received a response from PepsiCo or Quaker. The company has not announced any plans for revival, limited edition return, or licensed reissue of any kind. On eBay, the market filled the void that the company had left. Vintage King Vitaman boxes from the 1970s and 1980s, the ones featuring George Mann in his checkered robe and golden spoon crown, began appearing at prices that reflected their new status as artifacts rather than food containers. The Click and Count Premium from 1972, the Viewmaster offer from 1975, the Cutout Mass from the 1980s, all of it surfaced in the collector marketplace, cataloged and priced and shipped to people who were not buying breakfast, but buying back a piece of a morning they could no longer otherwise access. Expired boxes of the cereal itself appeared at prices above $14, listed by sellers who understood that some customers would pay that much simply to hold the box again, to read the back panel, to smell whatever remained inside. The shelf that the man from Cleveland had been checking for years was empty now. He had voted the cereal awesome on MrBreakfast.com. Not because awesome was the right word for a breakfast cereal, he explained, but because there was no option for what he actually felt, which was something closer to gratitude. He had grown up with it. He had driven out of his way for it. And now it was gone. And the store where he had last bought it looked like every other store. And the shelf where it had lived held something else that he had no particular reason to reach for. The kingdom was over. The crown-shaped pieces were gone. And somewhere in a building in Purchase, New York, a line item in a product portfolio had been quietly closed. Its 51 years of Saturday mornings reduced to a date range in a discontinued SKU database that no one outside the company would ever read. The cereal was gone, but the people who remembered it were not, and they were not finished talking about it. When King Vitaman left the shelf, it did not leave a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the grocery business. The space that King Vitaman had occupied, the fortified, moderately priced, lightly sweetened cereal that a working family could feel reasonable about buying, did not stay empty. Other products moved in. Cap'n Crunch was already there, made by the same company, occupying adjacent shelf space with a higher sugar content and a marketing budget that King Vitaman had not seen in 40 years. Kix, made by General Mills, offered a corn-based option with even less sugar and a long history of positioning itself as the cereal mothers approved of. Total Whole Grain, also from General Mills, covered the vitamin fortification angle with a whole grain profile that fit more naturally into the early 2000s conversation about nutrition than King Vitaman's aging formula ever could. None of them were the same. The people who had been buying King Vitaman knew that immediately, the way you always know when a substitute is a substitute. The flavor profile was different. The texture was different. The shape was different. You could approximate the experience, but approximation is not the thing itself. And the people who had been eating King Vitamin since childhood were not looking for an approximation. They were looking for the cereal. And the cereal was gone. The closest thing to a parallel story in the Quaker portfolio was Quisp, the saucer-shaped cereal from the same J. Ward era, launched in 1965, discontinued in the 1970s, and then revived as a specialty nostalgia product available through outlet stores, online retailers, and eventually a direct-to-consumer website. Quisp is survived because someone at Quaker made a deliberate decision to keep it alive in a limited form, to acknowledge that its audience, though small, was real and loyal and willing to pay for access. King Vitaman never received that decision. No limited edition run, no online-only revival, no acknowledgement from the company that 51 years of customer loyalty was worth even a token gesture of recognition. Where Quisp got a second life, King Vitaman got silence. The contrast is instructive. Both cereals came from the same era, the same studio, the same parent company. Both had devoted followings that persisted decades after their commercial peaks. The difference between them is not one of sentiment or cultural significance. It is one of corporate will. Someone decided Quisp was worth saving. Nobody made that decision for King Vitaman. What does it mean when the cereal that fed working families for 50 years disappears without a single word from the company that made it? It means, among other things, that the people those families trusted to maintain access to an affordable, government-approved nutritional staple were never thinking about those families when they made the decision to stop. The WIC certification that had defined King Vitaman's second identity, the cereal for households where the budget was tight and the nutritional value mattered, disappeared along with the product itself. The families who had relied on it as an approved benefit did not receive a letter of explanation. They received an empty shelf, the same as everyone else. The communities where King Vitaman had been most reliably present, the Midwest, the South, the working-class neighborhoods of cities like Cleveland and Charlotte and Orlando, where Marks and Food Lion and Kroger anchored the weekly grocery run, felt the absence in practical terms as well as sentimental ones. This was not simply the loss of a childhood memory. It was the loss of a specific, affordable, trusted option in a food category where affordable and trusted options are not in abundant supply. The reverse engineering community did what it always does. Cereal enthusiasts online compared formulas, noted that King Vitaman shared its fundamental corn and oat base with Cap'n Crunch and Quisp, and concluded that the three were essentially the same recipe in different shapes. This was true as far as it went, but the people who had spent decades eating King Vitaman knew that the shape was not incidental. The crown-shaped pieces created a different eating experience than the pillow-shaped Cap'n Crunch pieces or the saucer-shaped Quisp pieces. They held differently in the spoon. They broke differently against the teeth. The milk moved through them differently. The shape was not decorative. It was functional. And no amount of ingredient matching could recreate what the shape contributed to the experience. No artisan cereal maker has produced a tribute version. No crowdfunding campaign has succeeded in financing a small batch revival. The formula exists somewhere in a Quaker archive, in whatever form corporate recipe documentation takes, inaccessible to the people who would most want to use it. What King Vitaman leaves behind is not a lesson that the food industry is likely to teach in its business schools. It is a lesson about what happens when institutional memory and customer loyalty are assigned no weight in the calculations that determine which products survive. A cereal that had been purchased by the same families for 50 years, that had been trusted enough by the federal government to be certified as a nutritional staple for the most vulnerable households in the country, was discontinued without announcement, without consultation, and without any apparent consideration of what its absence would mean to the people who had depended on it. The king is gone. The shelf is full of other things. And somewhere in the comment sections of breakfast cereal review websites, the people who remember him are still talking, not because they expect anyone in a position of power to listen, but because the memory is real, and real things deserve to be spoken out loud. There was a moment somewhere in the middle of a Saturday morning in 1973 or 1974 or 1975. The exact year does not matter, because the morning was the same in all of them, when everything was exactly right. The house was quiet. The television was on. The bowl was in front of you, and the cereal was in the bowl, and the milk was cold, and the little crown-shaped pieces were holding their crunch the way they always did, resisting the milk just long enough to give you something real to bite into. The king on the box looked out at you with that expression he always had, certain, slightly imperious, completely convinced that what was in that box was worth your full attention. He was not wrong. The taste was not complicated. It did not need to be. Lightly sweet toasted corn and oat, a flavor that asked nothing of you and gave back something steady and familiar every single time. The milk at the bottom of the bowl was worth drinking. The back of the box was worth reading. And outside the kitchen window, the Saturday morning was still mostly ahead of you, unhurried, unscheduled, belonging entirely to itself. Nobody was asking you to be anywhere else yet. Nobody would be for hours. That is the thing King Vitaman gave to the people who grew up with it. Not nutrition, though it delivered that. Not excitement, though the commercials were genuinely funny and the box back genuinely entertaining. What it gave was a particular quality of morning. A morning that had a shape and a texture and a taste that was the same week after week in a way that made it something you could count on. Children need things they can count on. Not big things necessarily, small things. Reliable things. The bowl on the table. The king on the box. The crunch that was there every time you reached for it. King Vitaman was that, for 2 generations of American families. For the child who grew up eating it in 1972 and the child who grew up eating it in 1988, separated by 16 years and likely by everything else, different cities, different circumstances, different everything. The cereal was the same. The crown-shaped pieces were the same. The taste was the same. The king on the box was the same king, looking out with the same expression, making the same implicit promise that breakfast in this house was going to be all right. That promise was not made by the Quaker Oats Company exactly. It was made by the mothers and fathers and grandparents who put the box in the cart every week, who set the bowl on the table before the child came downstairs, who understood without articulating it that a consistent, affordable, trusted breakfast was one of the ways a family said to its children, "You are taken care of. You are steady. The world outside may be uncertain, but the table is set and the cereal is there, and the morning belongs to you." When that cereal disappears, when the box is gone from the shelf without explanation, and the company that made it offers no acknowledgement, and the shelf is filled with something else as if nothing of consequence has happened, something is lost that cannot be fully named. It is not just a flavor. It is not just a product. It is the specific weight of a specific box in a child's hands. It is the sound the pieces made in the bowl. It is the king on the front looking out, and the maze on the back waiting to be solved, and the cold milk going in, and the television playing in the other room, and the morning wide open in front of you. Nobody makes that morning anymore. It cannot be manufactured or revived or shipped to your door in a nostalgia box at a premium price. It existed in a particular time, in particular kitchens, eaten by particular people who are now in their 50s and 60s, and who carry it with them the way people carry the specific textures of their childhoods. Not always consciously, not always with sadness, but with a fidelity that does not diminish with the passing of years. The workers who ran the production lines that made those crown-shaped pieces deserve to be remembered. The food scientists at Quaker who spent years getting the formula right deserve to be remembered. The animators at J. Ward Productions, who gave the king his voice and his knights their incompetence, deserve to be remembered. George Mann, who put on the checkered robe and the golden spoon crown and looked into the camera with complete conviction for 6 years, deserves to be remembered. And the families, the millions of ordinary American families who bought the box every week, who trusted it, who fed it to their children, who drove out of their way to find it when it became hard to find. They deserve more than anyone to have their loyalty acknowledged as the real and significant thing it was. The crown was never really about vitamins. The crown was about Saturday morning and a bowl of something sweet, and the king on the box looking out like he had all the answers. Nobody makes that king anymore. But somewhere tonight, someone is describing those little crowns to a person who never tasted them. And that person understands, from the way it is described, that something real was here and is gone.